is not only the beginning of our library lecture series, but it is the grand opening of this beautiful auditorium. So everything here in the library is a labor of love, and this one in particular is, I need to say. It was about 4 years ago, Mary?
Yes.
Okay. 4 years ago, I said to Mary Reeves, whom probably most of you know, Mary, don't you think it'd be a good idea if we put the DVDs up in a room all by themselves and you could, have your own space? And she, in her Mary-like way, was very excited and worried and went away for the summer and got a committee together and came back at the end of the summer saying, let's have an auditorium. And I had no idea that that little idea would grow into this beautiful space. On the back of your program is a list of people who were influential in making this space happen. First is our dear departed, beloved, canonized Jill Tiefenthaler, who was so good to us in the library, and for 2 years we were riding on a pinky swear that this auditorium would in fact happen. She said, we're going to do it, believe me, and she made the money available. Jim Alty, who was also very influential in that building process, and we're grateful to him. Mary, of course, is the inspiration for this whole thing. I threatened to call it the Mary Reeves, not memorial, I guess. But the Mary Reeves Auditorium. However, we are hoping for a donor someday. Maybe we won't call it that. Mary Beth, where she has guided the process of the construction. Steve Jarrett has been, what I'm told, enormously influential, going back to the original days of the committee and helping spec out all the equipment and saying, yes, in fact, this will work. So we thank you, Steve. And Craig Fansler is where... Craig has a hand in just about everything in the library, so I am told that for this project, it was your original rendering of what could be possible inspired Jill and Jim Alty and everybody to make this happen. In your program is also some ideas on how you as faculty or students could use this space, so look at this and think about ideas. Everything we have in the library is available to the Wake Forest community. We don't charge for our facilities. We like to share our resources in our facilities, so if you can think of a great use of this space, please contact Mary Beth Locke. There's a web form available on our website, and we hope that it will be used every day of the year. I think that might conclude my opening remarks. I'm just happy that Katie is the one who can kick this off. And Chris Burroughs will tell you more about Katie at her topic, right?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge all the members of the Library Lecture Series who are here today. So if you could just please stand. We have a full area of programming for this coming semester. So the bookmarks that were inside your programs will tell you what we're going to be doing this semester. So would love to see you at every event. So please come and support us. And that brings me to the introduction of today's speaker, Dr. Katie Harriger. Dr. Harriger received her PhD from the University of Connecticut and is currently professor and chair of the political science department here at Wake Forest. She teaches courses in the areas of constitutional law, American politics, the judicial process, and civic engagement. Her recent publications include Judicial Supremacy or Judicial Defense, the Supreme Court and the Separation of Powers, and Political Science and the Work of Democracy. Her current research involves using the papers of former Supreme Court justices to study how the law has changed in the areas of separation of powers and racial segregation in the schools. So without further ado, may I present Dr. Katie Harriger.
Well, thank you all for coming. If I'd known so many people I know were coming, I'd be more nervous. Or I would have been nervous sooner, I think. But thank you, and thank you, Chris, and the committee for inviting me, and I just want to say to Lynn, the things you and your staff have done with the library are so exciting, and I really appreciate all the energy and excitement around the library these days. Okay, great. So I'm thankful for this opportunity. I want to start with a disclaimer, as all good speeches should. And the first is to say that as I began working on this, I realized just how huge a topic it is, and so I had to spend a lot of time narrowing things down. And if I don't talk about something that you wanted to talk about, there should be time for questions and answers to do that. And Chris has orders from me to cut me off if I go on too long, so that there'll be time to do that. But the second is to say that for political scientists in particular, I'm uncomfortable with analyzing a decade of politics through the lens of a single event. And I think that, particularly in the last week, as we've looked at all the sort of analysis of 9/11 and the impact of 9/11, that there's been a lot of that in the media. And as a political scientist, it makes me uncomfortable because we always say things are way more complicated than that. That is, any sort of singular event cannot really explain all that's happened in the 10 years. And so what I'm going to try to do here is to talk about and to try to disentangle what we might actually attribute to 9/11 and its aftermath, and what are really sort of broader trends in American politics that we ought to recognize as broader trends, things that might have happened anyway, regardless of whether 9/11 ever happened. And so to sort of in that vein, I want to call to your attention a recent article that was in Slate magazine about what would happen if political scientists wrote the news. Because they're making this particular point that political scientists tend to think about things in sort of broader trends and not in terms of the particular. So here's just a few things that if political scientists had written the news in the last year or so, they might have said. Obama now faces some of the most difficult challenges of his young presidency: the ongoing oil spill, the Gaza flotilla disaster, and revelations about possibly inappropriate conversations between the White House and candidates for federal office. But while these narratives may affect fleeting public perceptions, Americans will ultimately judge Obama on the crude economic fundamentals of job numbers and GDP. Chief among the criticisms of Obama was his response to the spill. Pundits argued that he needed to show more emotion. Their analysis, however, should be viewed in light of the economic pressures on the journalism industry, combined with the 24-hour news environment and the lack of new information about the spill itself. And so I'm going to try to do that with the topic of 9/11 and American politics in the last decade, which is to say, here are some things that we think and that we see, but what should we recognize as being about something broader, and what might we attribute to the event itself. The other thing, of course, is to recognize that 9/11 has had a huge impact on our role in the world, and that isn't something that I'm going to spend any time or very little time talking about. So my focus is really going to be on two things that I feel sort of most comfortable talking about, which is presidential politics and constitutional law. And then I want to close with some sort of maybe broader and more personal reflections about American political culture and how I think it has been affected by 9/11. So the first thing to say, which will not be a revelation to anyone in the room, is that the presidency of George W. Bush was profoundly affected by 9/11. I think we can agree that that singular event did affect the presidency of George W. Bush. If you look at the public opinion polls in terms of general popularity ratings of the president during that first year prior to the events of 9/11, what you see is that he was actually in a different place than most presidents are in that sort of honeymoon period after their inauguration. The average across the time that we've been measuring this for presidents in that first set of months there, in that first year, is for their popularity rating to be around 64%. And that's always above whatever the vote was that they got. So there's this sort of period of where people are kind of giving the president the benefit of the doubt. But if you remember that the presidential election of 2000 was actually bitterly fought, closely divided, and in fact a majority of the public voted for two other candidates when you add them together. That is, if you put the votes for Al Gore and the votes for Ralph Nader, the majority of people voted in another way. And so he entered the presidency in a relatively weak position compared to most presidents in that particular period of time. His popularity rating covered just over 50%. in that period of time leading up to 9/11, which is unusual. It's 12 points below what the sort of average for presidents is. If you look at what happens with popularity ratings immediately following 9/11, you see a very dramatic shooting up of popularity. So that his popularity just after 9/11 was at 90%, which is astronomical and not sustainable for any particular president. What you see then is that over the course of that period of time after 9/11 until the war in Iraq was started was a pretty steady decline again in terms of popularity. So he's a little bit above where he had been at the start, but not substantially higher just before the start of the war in Iraq. But after the start of the war in Iraq, he goes back up to 70%, 71% in terms of popularity ratings. So, did war make a difference for George Bush? It certainly made a difference in terms of the public's perception of him as a leader and their willingness to support the actions that he took. And what we know about popularity ratings is that while they are not everything, they do help the president in terms of having public opinion on his side in other policy debates as well. In other words, most presidents would prefer to have those numbers than not, for very good reasons that have to do with the ability to govern and to have your case be heard in Congress and those sorts of things. Here's where we should make a long-term note, though. That kind of movement is very common. And it's very common for the public in the short term to rally around the president and to rally around the flag when crisis and when war occur. And so it's not surprising that we see that, but it certainly, I think, had an effect on his presidency. The one thing this is the thing that's impossible to know. So the problem for political scientists is that we can't run a controlled experiment where we have sort of one chain of events that occurs without the attack and one that does, so that we can then single out what are the actual effects. And so it's very hard to say, I think, whether or not Bush would have been reelected in 2004 without 9/11. I think incumbents tend to be favored in elections. Lots of things come into play in the short term, and so I think it's very difficult to say that he would not have been reelected in 2004. I do think it's possible to say that the fact that we were engaged in a war, the fact that there was still a very high sort of sense of insecurity, that security issues dominated the election, the off-year election of 2002 and the election of 2004, helped the Republicans prevail in those two elections. Another long-term trend in public opinion has been that when the issues that are on the agenda, the issues that drive an election are issues around national security, Republicans tend to be favored by voters. When the issues are around the economy, around domestic issues, the voters tend to favor Democrats. And so the fact that in 2002, an off-year election where we would have expected a loss of seats by the Republicans, because that's the norm, that's the historical norm, the fact that the Republicans prevailed in 2004 and in 2002 and 2004, I think can be attributed to the fact that national security was the dominant issue at the time. That's sort of what was driving voters. The other thing that we can't know is whether or not a different president would have done something differently with that period of time after 9/11 in which there was a really high state of unity, where the sort of country came together, where not just in the United States, but I think you could say internationally, there were signs all over the place that said, we are all Americans now. There was a period of time there brought about by the tragedy and the shock of it all that brought people together. The members of Congress standing on the steps singing God Bless America was probably in 2001 more meaningful than it was a couple days ago when they did it again. But the tendency is, in these sort of crises, to fall sort of back into usual patterns. And so I think it's not surprising to me, regardless of who was in power, that we would have sort of dropped back into our more sort of traditional ways of playing politics. And elections tend to encourage us to do that. So the Republicans decided in 2002 and in 2004 to take advantage of this national security advantage and to use it in ways that certainly broke up the willingness of Democrats to be sort of we're all in this together kind of thing. They were accused of being in various negative ads of being unpatriotic, of being soft on terrorism, all sorts of things that sort of generally don't set well in a political context. And so if there was an opportunity there to sort of move forward together as a country, it was certainly lost, I think, by 2002. And we returned to a pattern of polarization that had been there prior to 9/11. So that's the other point to make, is that 9/11 and Bush did not create the polarized politics that we have. It existed before. Clearly the election of 2000 is exhibit A for that. But I think you can trace it back at least to the Clinton presidency and the way in which politics developed in the 1990s, and possibly even before that. So it's not surprising then that we sort of drop back to a place where we had been after this sort of period of coming together. The next point to make about politics is to say that by 2008, that national security advantage was gone. The war had dragged on. We had not been successful in that war or in either war, either in Afghanistan or in Iraq. The number of people dying had increased. The weariness of the war generally in the American public was significant. And so what had worked for the Republicans in 2002 and 2004 worked against them in 2006 and 2008. In addition, the economy sort of moved forward in 2008 as a more important issue, and that tended to favor Democrats. So regardless of who the Democratic nominee was and who the Republican nominee was in 2008, all of the signs that political scientists look at suggested that the Democrats would win that election, and also in 2006. Because of the shift in focus and because of the loss by the Republicans of the national security advantage. It really wasn't there anymore because the war was over. What happens in 2012, I think, is very difficult to predict at this point. What I think is very clear is that Obama owns the Afghan war now, trying to draw down the Iraq war as he promised, but the Afghan war continues. The events of this weekend showing that many people are still dying and the Taliban have not been neutralized in any significant way. And so that could play a role, but I think the primary issue, again, as it was in 2008, will be the economy. Again, no major insight here. I think we all recognize that. That the battle, at least right now, looking at it right now, will be fought over economics, predominantly, and some other more domestic issues, with the war being really sort of a side issue, although I think they will be significant. The other impact I want to point out of Bush being reelected in 2004 that has some implications for the next point I want to go to about constitutional law is that because he was reelected in 2004, he had the opportunity to make two appointments to the Supreme Court that I think in the long term will have an impact on the court's views about executive power. So when O'Connor retired and then Rehnquist died and he got to put Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito on the court, he put two people whose careers were based on sort of making a case for executive power in the Department of Justice, and I think are much more sort of prone towards supporting the exercise of executive power certainly than O'Connor was, at least. And so I think that has an implication for some of the things that I want to say. So if we look at electoral politics, presidential electoral politics, I think you can see some long-term trends that would have happened anyway, but I think some things in particular that are important in terms of understanding what's happened in the last decade in terms of political elections, or presidential elections. So then I want to switch to saying something about constitutional law, and particularly about the court and its relationship to sort of upholding constitutional principles or not. It's been said that the real test of a country's commitment to constitutionalism, that is to living by its constitutional values that are in its document, comes at a time of war, not at peace, right? I mean, it's pretty easy to do that when you don't feel threatened, when you feel secure to say everybody has free speech and this kind of thing. So the real test comes in wartime. And if you look historically at the United States experience with that, what you see is that we have, really every time we have been at war, we have had problems, clashes, conflicts between decision makers making decisions about national security and the protection of individual rights. Historically, the court has been hesitant to step into that fray and to support rights over the exercise of power by the president and by Congress, or the president and Congress together, or by the military. So they've tended to take a pretty deferential position. In World War I, you have a set of cases that involved war resistors, people who were fighting against the draft, and some of our most famous cases about free speech come from that particular period of time. And in those cases, the court sort of took the side of the government in saying that national security and the threat to national security justified the restrictions on free speech. In World War II, the sort of classic example is the Korematsu versus United States case, in which the court deferred to the military and to the president in terms of saying that it was okay to intern people of Japanese descent after Pearl Harbor in the interests of national security. In Vietnam, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, except I think what you could say there is the court largely attempted to avoid being drawn into the question, and as a consequence deferred, but didn't actually decide particular cases. There are a few cases involving protesters where the court defends the right to protest, and some others where it doesn't. So it's a much more mixed story. But what I find interesting about the post 9/11 court is, and one of the articles that Chris mentioned that I just wrote about the court, judicial supremacy and separation of powers, is really about this, is that the cases challenging the military tribunals and the treatment of detainees in Guantanamo, in particular about whether or not they had access to the federal courts, a series of cases between 2004 and 2008. In all of those cases, while the court said that the president did, in a war context, have the right to detain people, they also said in all of those cases, by shrinking majorities, but nonetheless in all of those cases, they held that they could not be denied the right to access to federal courts to make a claim. And so they took a pretty strong, I would say, in the middle of a war, a fairly strong stance on behalf of due process, that you cannot detain forever without having a court review that particular detention. That's not the ordinary pattern, I think, of the Supreme Court. And so in that sense, I think it's an interesting development. I mean, if Justice O'Connor said in one of those cases, presidents do have more power at times of war, but it's not a blank check. And to have that in our constitutional law as precedent, I think, is significant and ought to be recognized. The last case, the case in 2008, however, was decided by a mere 5-4 majority, and this is after these new members of the court were on there, and they've had a much more deferential position about executive power. So I think whether that's a sustainable kind of change is not clear to me, but I think those cases are significant and should be recognized as significant in terms of due process during a time of war, given all of the sort of pressures against that. The other long-term trend that I think is important to recognize here in terms of constitutional law, besides the fact that the court tends to be deferential, is the expansion of presidential power, especially in the war context, across the 20th century and the 21st century. So the claims that George W. Bush made, and that now President Obama has made with regard to Libya and being involved in Libya, are part of a long-term 20th century trend in which the president, vis-a-vis Congress, has been, I think, very clearly advantaged in decision-making about war. And that's a function of a lot of things, including the sort of speed with which war occurs, communications changes, a lot of different things that happen over the course of that time. And so the claims that George Bush made about presidential power in times of war were not actually that far off of a number of claims made by a number of presidents, and that have been happening over the course of time. I do think that there was a point at which the arguments that were being made were much broader claims of executive power. I mean, in other words, the extent to which he took some of those claims broader than some other presidents have made. But I do think it's important to recognize that they were within this context of this shift to the president being the actor and having the advantage vis-a-vis Congress in terms of acting. So once the president commits troops, it's very hard for Congress to say, get them out of there. Because Now there's the whole rally around the flag, all the troops are there, they're not safe. If we take money away, what will happen to them? How will we look in the eyes of the world? All of those kinds of things give the advantage to the president and make it very difficult for Congress to turn that around and change that. And that was the reality after 9/11. The other thing that's important to recognize is that I think that is true, again, because we can't run the counter experiment, we don't know. I think it's true that Al Gore also would have gone to war in Afghanistan. To me, the different question is whether, and I think probably not, would he have gone to war in Iraq. But I think the mood of the country, the horror of the attack, the whole sort of context of that particular time, the mood of Congress all suggests that any president would have felt it necessary to take out the Taliban and to go after Osama bin Laden. The thing we can't know for sure is whether that's true, but certainly we can't know whether Iraq would have happened, but I think less likely to have happened. And one related constitutional issue before I move away and sort of move towards a broader discussion about political culture, but I think it leads us to this, is about American attitudes about civil liberties and national security in a post 9/11 context. Perhaps because I teach civil liberties, I find this troubling, or maybe particularly troubling. But the number of people willing to say that they are willing to give up their civil liberties in exchange for a greater sense of security was very significantly high after 9/11, and I find that interesting coming from a country and from a culture that at least claims to value individual freedom at the level that it does, that is, that you see in popular culture. So I have a few figures in terms of polls taken over the course of the decade. In September 13th and 14th, 2001, 61% of the country said that in order to curb terrorism in this country, it will be necessary for the average person to give up some civil liberties. 61% said yes, 33% said no. Interestingly, the last time this question was asked, which was in 2007, it was 40% who said yes and 54% who said no. So as we move away from the event and the sort of level of fear decreases, I think we see a shift in that. But on some of the other questions, you don't see quite as dramatic a shift. Would you be willing to give up some of your personal freedom in order to reduce the threat of terrorism? In 2001, the answer was yes. 20% said no. 71% said yes, 20% said no. In 2006, which of the following statements come closer to your view? Americans should be willing to give up some of their civil liberties so the government can keep the country safe from terrorism. Or Americans should not be willing to allow the government to take away their civil liberties in the name of keeping the country safe. This is a 2006 LA Times poll. 51% give up liberties for safety. 40% do not allow civil liberties to be taken. So it's still a majority, but a much smaller majority as we move away from them. The other sort of more anecdotal data is when I talk to my students about this question, what's the balance between civil liberties and national security? The significant number who say, well, I don't mind giving that up because I'm not doing anything wrong. Right? So why would you care if your phone is tapped, if you're not saying anything that would get you into any trouble? And while I understand that argument and it makes sense sort of at one level, it's troubling to think that that's how you think about civil liberties. Because, and so I always say to the question, do you think that we have a Bill of Rights in order to make sure that bad people are protected from the government? And of course the answer to that question is no. That's not why we have a Bill of Rights, right? It's to limit the power of government, even for people who aren't doing anything wrong, right? It's not. So the concern, this sort of willingness to toss it aside without sort of thinking about why we have the protections that we have, I think is troubling, and leads me to the sort of final and closing points that I want to make about what I perceive as a shift in American political culture that worries me. And so if you can indulge me with a little bit of personal storytelling as I make this point, I would appreciate it. So the first thing is to say that in 1977, when I was in college, I spent a summer in Spain. That was the summer after Franco, the dictator, had died. The country was moving towards its first democratic election. And the streets were still full of police and military people with machine guns. And as a young American from a rural area of Pennsylvania, this was shocking and unsettling to me. We would be a group of students walking down a street, and a guy would step out in front of you with a submachine gun. It was really scary, even though for Spaniards, that was something that they were in fact quite used to. We were visiting a church on a square one time, and all of a sudden, the whole area got cordoned off. All these military guys jump out of trucks, helicopters start circling all over. We take off and run out the back of the church so we can get out of there, and we find out later when we get back to our house that there was a peaceful demonstration of a party, one of the new political parties, that was going to march on this. And so, again, this sort of notion that that could be the experience of people exercising their political rights was very unsettling. And I came back to the United States, both having learned a great deal about Spain and about the world, and having all the, I think, eye-opening experiences that you have, but also having this great appreciation for the freedom and security of living in a country where that didn't happen on a regular basis, where you didn't expect to see people with machine guns in your daily life, right? You would see them in some places, but it wasn't sort of part of your normal experience. So fast forward, the first time I flew after 9/11, which was it was in early October, shortly after the airports opened back up again. I got to the Greensboro airport and I check in, and there's National Guardsmen all over the place with machine guns. And of course, a very intense security screening that happens, and I will admit to sort of being glad in some way that that was happening, but it also made me incredibly sad. And I actually sort of went through that and got to the other side in tears. And it was because I thought about it, I thought, was it fear that did that? And it wasn't. It was really a sadness, and I sort of flashed back to that revelation in '77 about the country that I lived in and the freedom that I had, and I felt we lost something that I don't even know how to describe precisely what it was, but we lost something that we recognize in its absence, that has to do with a sense of freedom that seems to be gone. And so just 2 weeks ago, I flew out west to a conference and went through hours of standing in line and screaming, and I didn't, if I cried at the end of it, it was probably out of frustration, not fear or a sense of loss. But it's just sort of recognition of the new normal that we experience is not what we used to have. We lost something that has made us different in some way, and I think it's something to grieve for. The second point about American culture that I want to make that I think is related to this is also about a sense of loss of something. And again, I want to start it with a personal story. When I spent a semester in London in the spring of 2000, one of the things that struck me, I guess, because I was teaching comparative politics, so I always sort of thinking about what's different about the U.S. than here, what's different about Europe than here. But one of the things that struck me about the difference between Americans and many of the British people that we met was a kind of outlook on life that I would describe, probably overly simplistically, as a sort of sense of optimism that Americans had, a sort of sunniness, perhaps even naivete about the world, compared to what's sometimes called the stiff upper lip of sort of British culture, this kind of buckle down and endure it kind of way of approaching the world. And of course, once you experience the weather in London for a semester, it becomes obvious at least one of the reasons why that might be true. but it just felt different, and I came back from that appreciating that, again, in the same way that I came back from Spain with an appreciation of my own country in particular ways, as well as an appreciation of Spain. I came back from London with that appreciation too. And what I feel that we've lost is that sense of optimism that you might call sort of perhaps not uniquely American, but a characteristic of American political culture that may contribute to the sort of sense of creativity, of entrepreneurship, of we can get it done, we can do it, and that and at its best is about pulling together to solve the problems that we have. I recognize that there's a dark side to that, and I don't want to overplay the upside of it. There's a dark side to sort of thinking we can do everything, right? That we can solve problems. But there's a good side too, and I think that we have lost that. That if you look at our politics and our culture, our political culture today, there's a kind of hunkering down, a kind of I'm going to protect what I have, a kind of cynicism about our own abilities to solve problems, cynicism about the government's ability to solve problems, that I worry is a long-term impact, and and I feel that it's something that we've lost. One might argue that what 9/11 did was make Americans grow up. But I think maybe that we've lost something that was the key to who we are. And if that's so, then I think the impact of 9/11 is in fact quite profound on American politics. So I'll stop there. I'd be happy to take questions or comments. Is there time for questions?
I would just agree with your last point about making America more grown up. In some ways, I think the politics of America since 9/11 in the last 2-3 years has become more childish and seeking simple answers and for very, very complex problems, and sort of shutting off reality, denying global warming, denying all sorts of things that have become recognized science, and just turning a blind eye to it, and the politicians speaking seriously, and voters taking these what I consider to be ignorant positions very seriously. And it's all or nothing kind of politics that we're witnessing now with the Tea Party and the way the GOP is behaving. So I'd like you to clarify what you meant by more grown up.
I said perhaps. And I mean that only in the sense that sometimes we say that, having our blinders, like if optimism is naivete, if it's wearing rose-colored glasses, and we sort of have them removed by some kind of experience, it sort of forces us to confront a different reality. That the world's not necessarily a good place. That we don't actually have the ability to do the things we think we have to do, and that's a form of growing up. I'll have to say, Dave, that I think what you're describing as a short-term characteristic of politics is actually a much longer-term characteristic of American politics, and that this is what I would consider the dark side of optimism, or this characteristic of American political culture that I would describe, which is there's a tendency for the short term to think about the short term, not the long term. I think we've always had problems as a country addressing problems over the long term. And I would say that at least in terms of modern politics, not just the last few years, but really since the advent of television in particular, the vast oversimplification of issues has been a reality in American politics. So,
you were mentioning something about national security. Do you think that Obama has brought that back on the table, or has brought it back because of in the spring Osama bin Laden was killed in a successful mission? What is your take on that now?
If you look at sort of the public's reaction to that event, what you do see is an upswing in support for him in terms of his handling of the war and his role as commander-in-chief. It doesn't last. I think people are just so weary of the war. So I think he got perhaps some short-term benefit out of that. Whether it'll make any difference in 2012, I think is impossible to predict.
I was kind of expecting you to speak a little bit about the Patriot Act, and sort of, maybe you could even call it like paranoia that kind of arose within the government. And I thought it was interesting how you said that you even think Al Gore and pretty much any candidate would have gone into the war in Afghanistan. Do you feel that other candidates, specifically Democrats, maybe would have passed similar legislation as the Patriot Act, as Bush did, sort of handled the national security versus, constitutional liberties issue the same way?
So, there's
It's
a
a bit
lot
of a broad question. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no, it's a good, and I actually had some things in here about the Patriot Act that I skipped over. So, would some legislation have been passed? Probably, because I do think because of the mood of the country at that particular time. Whether it would have been that precise legislation, I think is hard to know for sure. One of the things that a lot of people don't know about the Patriot Act is a big chunk of it was already written during the Clinton administration after the Oklahoma City bombings, and that Republicans in Congress at that time refused to pass it. Particularly those that were seen as the most sort of threatening to civil liberties. So a good chunk of that act was sitting in the Department of Justice waiting for an opportunity. And so the opportunity presented itself. So for some portion of it, I mean, given that Al Gore probably participated in the writing of that part of it that was written after Oklahoma City, I think it's probably the case that some portion of it would have been proposed. I think the question would be whether or not, what would have been the reaction in Congress. The first attempt after the Oklahoma City bombings didn't pass. But prosecutors from both parties in the Department of Justice had wanted a lot of those things, particularly those that had to do with the kinds of evidence you could use and that are in the Patriot Act, had wanted that for quite some time, as some people have described as prosecutors' dream. And one of the problems, I think, with the Patriot Act is that virtually no one in Congress read it before they pass it. Anytime Congress passes a law, I have a date in here somewhere that it passed the Patriot Act. It was, I think, October 7th. No, it was before that. It was 1 week. That's not right either. Anyway, it was a very, very short period of time. Anytime Congress passes a bill in a month or less, you should be worried. Because Congress isn't supposed to act that way. Congress is supposed to be a deliberative body. And we criticize it for taking too long to do things, but it's really, frequently functioning in the way that it's supposed to. You make two bodies as different as possible from each other and make them agree. Right? But the climate after 9/11 was such that John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, sort of said anybody who doesn't support this must be supporting terrorism. And that when people fell in line across party lines.
I was wondering, post 9/11, it seems that the country went into a mode in which there was a lot of reaction to the event in terms of what should we do in terms of defense, what should we do as anti-terrorism measures to protect our country. But in New York, and especially in Manhattan, I think that a different series of events unfolded where there was a lot of open dialogue about opportunities for redeveloping Lower Manhattan. And it seems to have been framed very differently in New York than it was in the rest of the country. And I'm wondering why that optimism that came out of it in New York in what could have been a very different response didn't spread or didn't seem to happen elsewhere in our national response.
One of the things that I think is interesting about this whole decade, and certainly about the wars, and I think it relates to this point as well, is that the number of people who have felt the real impact of this event is actually fairly small. It's the people of New York, the people working in the Pentagon, to some extent other people in D.C. because they felt the vulnerability that came from that, and the people who've gone to war. And the rest of us have and I should say Muslim Americans. who have felt, probably more than anyone else, the brunt of losing a sense of privacy and having their civil liberties violated. And so if you don't have the personal effect of the tragedy to force you into reflection, I fear that you're much more susceptible to these other forces that are out there. So caught up in the patriotism. I talked to my students a lot the day that we went to war. None of them had any intention of signing up for the war, and yet they were all in favor.
The Afghanistan war?
Pardon me?
The Afghanistan war? The Afghanistan war?
And the Iraq war.
Oh.
And that has continued to be the case. The other thing that I didn't mention that I had in my notes to say is that the ordinary American response historically during times of war is to raise taxes, to pay for the war. And yet we have done the opposite in the last decade. And so one of the impacts of 9/11 on the election of 2000, and even though the economy is the issue that's driving it, is that the size of our deficit and our debt has been substantially impacted by the fact that we decided to fight 2 wars with not making any adjustment to our tax rate. Again, not prepared to pay the price for what we're willing to do, and I think that there are very negative consequences. I'm not sure that answers your question, David, except I think that there's a psychologically different impact on people who immediately experience these things and those who don't. But I'm not a psychologist.
This has already come up in a couple of questions. David's reference to all or nothing, which reminds me of
It's hard to hear you.
the older people can hear you. Talked about all or nothing politics, which is described in a recent book, Winner-Take-All Politics by Hacker and Pearson. And then you mentioning that the Justice Department was just waiting for an opportunity to do this, which reminds me of Naomi Klein and the Shock Doctrine. So what I'd like is sort of a reality check on my own simplistic notion that the only real lasting legacy of 9/11 is that it has accelerated our half-century transition from democracy to plutocracy. And that's the real legacy of what's been going on. So as a political scientist, how am I wrong about this? What just jumps out at you that I'm missing?
Well, since I share the notion that we've been moving in a direction that I find troubling in American politics, but I think for which I'm not prepared to blame a single party for. So I don't know whether in that sense I share what I hear some people saying. I think it's being caused by a sort of larger set of forces that are at work. I guess as a political scientist, what I would say is that if you, and my historian friend here can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you look at the sort of course of American history, what you see is more cyclical movements towards less and more democracy. And so I'm not prepared to say that we're on some unending march towards, what was the word you used? Plutocracy. Even if in the last several decades of our politics, you might say that, but there's some counter forces, I think, that are at work that show actually at the state and local level a lot of democracy. And so I don't think it's all sort of one sort of single march in a particular direction. I have some serious concerns about our national politics and the state that they're in. But it's also historically, I think, been the case that the challenges to that have come from grassroots politics that happen in some states and not others, and gradually things. So I don't despair in the long term, even though I despair regularly when I read the newspaper, and I don't watch television news at all anymore because that's the most despairing experience of all.
I wonder if you could explain to me the relationship between the Supreme Court and the government. I was thinking of that when you mentioned Al Gore. Do you remember when the Supreme Court gave, can I say, took it away from Al Gore?
So, the Supreme Court decided the case in a way that meant Al Gore lost and George Bush won, but most analyses of that would say that would have happened anyway. That is, if the court had stayed out of it, which frankly I actually believe that it should have, you still would have had the same outcome because of the arrangement of Florida politics. Because ultimately the state legislature in Florida would decide who was going to represent Florida in the Electoral College, and they were going to choose the Republican electors. So, defenders of the court, of which I am not one, would nonetheless point out that what the court did was, since that was the inevitable outcome anyway, they sort of cut it short so we could move on. I think it was the wrong thing for the court to do, but George Bush would have been our president because of the way our system works, because of the way the Electoral College works, because of the role of state legislatures in deciding where, who gets seated. The same outcome would have occurred.
If the court had been full of Democrats, still?
Yeah. It probably would have decided the case differently. But it would, I don't think it would have made a difference in the outcome of the election, ultimately.
Thank you.
One last question.
One last question.
Would you credit the rise of the Tea Party, this more radical sect of political discussion, as a direct link to the events of 9/11? So the destabilization of our political system, as when you have an event like that leading to these radical elements gaining greater voice?
That's a tough one. That's where I wish I had the running experiment on the other side. Because I think that some of that can be explained by paranoia about the stranger and the others. Like some of the things that you see, the whole birther movement and the anti-Muslim, the sort of assumption that Obama is a Muslim and therefore can't be trusted and those kinds of things. But that's just one part of the Tea Party. And so I think that to characterize all of it based on that would be a mistake. I think it's part of that sort of return to grassroots politics that I mentioned before. I mean, that's democracy in action. Is grassroots politics, people mobilizing in that particular way. I think that it represents a long strain in American politics, the sort of anti-national government politics that's been present from the beginning, and is sometimes stronger than other times in our politics. So I think it's a more complex phenomena than that, and I'm not sure that I would attribute that change to 9/11, with the exception of some of the anti-Muslim stuff that you see, which I think probably can be attributed to it. If you want to take a sort of step back and say, to the extent that some of our economic problems and our feelings of failure as a country are tied to 9/11, I think some of the Tea Party movement is a response to that. They might be the last optimists. Think about that one. But in this, this sort of but there's a way people react to that sort of sense of failure, right? That if we have this sort of widespread sense that things aren't working, then people have different reactions to that. Some people hunker down, some people mobilize. Is it driven to some extent by some fear? Yeah, I think it is. But I think it's more complex.
Germany in the 30s.
But I would not say that the Tea Party wouldn't exist if 9/11 hadn't happened. I would not say that.